right, so welcome everyone. I'm Jamie Lynn Tatera, and I'm here today with Chris Germer. And Chris has multiple hats that he sometimes wears. He is a lecturer on psychiatry at the Harvard Medical School. He is also the co-developer of the Mindful Self-Compassion program, which is huge. It's been taught to over 150,000 people around the world by some 3,000 mindful self-compassion teachers. And he also has he's a clinical psychologist. He's got a small private practice, and he's been involved in the past 35 years integrating mindfulness into psychotherapy, and in particular, the last 10 years focusing on integrating self-compassion. So I am just delighted to have Chris here with us for this Compassionate Presence course. And Chris, feel free to mention anything that I didn't share about you already, and just say hello to our friends who are watching this.
Thank you, Jamie. Yeah, thanks for the kind introduction as well. Mm-hmm.
And I met Chris a handful of years ago at a mindful self-compassion training, and was so impressed with his embodiment of a loving, connected presence. So I'm just happy to be here with you today. So one of my favorite meditations is actually one that you created. That's from your book. You're also an author, so I didn't mention that before. In one of your first book was well, it wasn't your first book, but the first book on mindful self-compassion was, I believe, can you name the title of that? It is.
Yeah, it was called The Mindful Path to Self-Compassion. Mm-hmm.
And you have this meditation in there as well as on your website called Waiting on Yourself. Mm-hmm. And I really love the meditation because sometimes for all of us, mindfulness or meditation can feel like a discipline. And it really, for me, embodies what it is, which is just an invitation to let go of efforting and notice what's going on with ourselves and our five senses. So would you be open to guiding us in that opening practice?
Sure. And I like the way you introduced it in terms of letting go of efforting. And also the topic of this course is presence. So meditation is really very simple. It's just about being present or noticing what's happening at any given moment. So that's what this little meditation is about. It's called waiting on ourselves. You know, how often do we wait on other people? We're, oriented to how they're feeling and what's going on for them and how they're relating to us. We're paying attention to others so much, especially parents, right? So to just take a moment to wait on ourselves is a radical thing to do, and it's crazy easy. So let's do that together, okay? So if you don't mind, you just find a comfortable place to sit, and you can allow your eyes to close partially or fully. Just beginning to allow yourself to feel the touch points of your body with the chair or the floor. Just noticing what it feels like to be sitting, or feeling what your feet feel like on the floor, just that moment of touch. And then allowing your awareness to go inside your body and noticing whatever physical sensations might be there, or perhaps even emotions. So whatever might be moving through your body right now. And seeing if you can make a lot of room for that experience, a lot of space. Just allowing it to be so, knowing that that's part of the human experience. It's part of being alive to feel this. And if you notice that you're putting any effort into this, trying hard to feel or to notice, see if you can let go of all that effort. Just let go of it and just notice what's here. Zero effort. And if you like, you can even tenderize your awareness a little bit. Soften your gaze. Imagine that your body was like the body of a young child, very young child, tender child, vulnerable child, innocent child. Imagine your body's just like that, and whatever sensations are going on inside, just like what might be happening inside of a young child. Allowing your awareness to be tender and soft, as if gazing at an innocent being. Allowing everything to be just as it is, if only for this one moment. And lastly, allowing yourself to be just as you are. Just as you are, right here and right now. Just like this. Just like this. Then when you're ready to slowly open your eyes.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was beautiful. Just permission to be. It's a rare thing I find in our daily lives, especially parents and educators. We do and we do and we do and we do, and permission to be is so beautiful, so beautiful. Thank you. So I'm thinking it might be good in our conversation together to start off by just defining what is shame, right? Like I've invited you here to talk to us about shame, and it's another book that you will be writing. I don't know if you have the title yet for your book on shame. Do you have the title yet, Chris?
Oh, the title, the publishers usually decide on the title in the last moment, but the overriding theme is on self-compassion, an antidote to shame,
So why don't you tell us a little bit about what shame is, and then also how self-compassion is an antidote to that?
Yeah, sure. So everybody knows what shame feels like, but shame is a funny emotion because it hides really well. Denial is just kind of a part of shame. Usually when shame happens, we just don't want to have anything to do with it. So shame is really probably one of the most difficult human emotions because we don't want to deal with it. But what is it? It really is an emotion that is characterized by negative self-evaluation. There's always a kind of attack on the self. In other words, blaming or criticizing, like, what's the matter with you? You're stupid. What were you thinking? That kind of thing. It's kind of an attack on the self. Guilt is more of a negative evaluation of a behavior, whereas shame is a negative evaluation of ourselves. So another way of thinking about it is, shame is I'm imagining what you are imagining about me, and it's not good. So not only do we have a negative evaluation of the self, but we're negatively evaluating ourselves in the minds of others, Yeah. So shame is a self-conscious emotion because we're reflecting on ourselves. It's also a social emotion because we're reflecting on what others are thinking about ourselves. And it's also a negative self-evaluation emotion because we're thinking critically about ourselves. That's the whole deal.
And it sounds so simple, and it's yet so hard. And I know we're not born with shame, right? We're not born with shame. But if we're not a sociopath, and that's good news, we develop shame.
Yeah.
And so do you want to tell us a little bit about how that shame becomes part of our consciousness, or at what age, and how does that develop?
Yeah. So thanks for that question. So it is true that we're not born with shame in terms of shame proneness. In other words, some people nobody comes into this world thinking I'm a bad person. That's learned. But what we are born with is the capacity for moments of shame. That is to say, when we're just merrily going about our business, doing what we love. So for example, if you're a 1-year-old child and what you love is spilling milk on the floor and you're just living your life, and then a parent says, "What's the matter with you, you stupid child, you blah, blah, blah." In other words, when the parent naturally gets angry and then criticizes the child, what happens is the child immediately stops. And that experience of that stop, and then often there's a kind of a contraction. So literally, even a child 2.5 to 3 months old, you can see if the parent is not responding the way the child expects, the child will avert its gaze, and it will drop its head, and it will also collapse its body. And these are 3 physical manifestations of shame throughout our lives, but it starts really early when we're criticized. So this is really adaptive for a young child that is doing something that they really have to stop. So like if a child, is harming its younger sister, and then the parent gets really mad and says, "How could you?" The child will stop. And if the child is made to feel bad enough about it, they probably are less likely to do it again. And that's really good. That's really adaptive. But if a parent is overwhelmed in life and just can't deal with a child, crying and hungry and needy and all this, and then the parent is always like blaming the child for what? For being a child. That becomes what we call shame proneness. It's not good for the child. So the gist of it is that it's really important for a child to have a very fast stop when they're doing something that's wrong. And shame is hardwired within us. When a important person gives us negative evaluation or treats us like we don't exist, we will stop what we're doing. And that's necessary for our growth and for the family, for the tribe. But when there's continuous treatment like this, then a child begins to internalize that experience of shame, and it becomes a shame habit, which is known in the research as shame proneness. So one thing it's really important for parents to know about is that it's inevitable that a parent is going to, get really mad at a child and also, as it were, attack the self of the child. This is inevitable. It's just part of human life. But what happens after that? Is there a kind of a repair that happens? Like, "Oh, honey, I know you love to play with milk and you love how it lands on the floor and it just looks amazing, but but you know what? We can't pour out the milk all the time. We're going to have to relocate the milk if you want to play, and I'll give you something else to play with. So in other words, this is a repair. A repair means you're honoring the inner state of the child, and you're also explaining to the child why a particular behavior is good or not good, or you're just making sure the child can't do that behavior if the child's not capable of learning at that point. And that kind of repair, basically the disconnection and then the reconnection, actually helps the child to grow as a person, as well as to understand the norms and the rules of, being able to function in life. So the fact of shame itself is very adaptive for the individual and for the group. However, chronic shaming eventually gets internalized by a child as shame proneness, and then throughout our lives we can be carrying around this experience of shame, and it can be really harmful. It can keep us from living fully, and it also can cause other problems. That's a long-winded answer, but that's how it emerges. Maybe the last thing I could say is that so these precursors to shame, this sort of lowered head and so forth, that will occur maybe 2.5 to 3 months. At about 1.5 to 2 years, a child develops a sense of self, like an I, rather than a we, like we're born into. An I, a sense of separate self. But only by 2.5 years old to 3 years old does a child actually develop also an awareness of how the child is in the minds of others. In other words, develops a social self. And in order to have real shame, you need to have not only self-awareness, but awareness of how we exist in the minds of others, that social selfness. So the scientists, they say shame really only occurs, say, after, at 2.5 or 3 years old. But what's interesting is that the norms of society, we may figure out what works in the family, but to learn what the norms are in society, it usually takes like 8 years. So some people say like full-on shame, which is, includes the culture that we're in, really only starts to bloom at 8 years old, which means we have a lot of time to protect our children from developing shame proneness, because it happens gradually.
Absolutely. And I think it probably even, at least teens, it seems like teens develop like the next level.
Oh, that's
of
another
shame
level.
proneness.
Yeah, so what happens with teens is as they then move out of the home, their self-evaluation is no longer just about, what's happening in the family, but like all their friends and what's happening in social media and so forth. And that is such a vulnerable time because who we are as a person is so dependent on the feedback that we get from others, the approval that we get from others. So therefore, those teen years, it's really important to begin to cultivate self-compassion, because self-compassion is self-worth that comes not from external approval, but from inner kindness. So self-compassion is a buffer or a protector for the self-worth of a child in that particularly in that age group, but frankly throughout the rest of life,
Absolutely. And I want to ask you more about self-compassion and how that is an antidote. But first I wanted to just share something that I've noticed and just hear your thoughts on it too. So I have 2 children, and my first child has a number of exceptional needs. She has dyslexia, she has sensory integration differences, she has really big feelings, and she grew up different, and she knew it. She knew that her behavior was not a match for what was appropriate. And it was really hard for me as a parent. And I think the first number of years, in some ways I did it right, but in some ways I did it wrong. My words were oftentimes, affirming, but my body language was like, you know what I mean? Like you're doing it wrong. And there's so many layers to this. You know, I think sometimes parents can get ashamed of their children's behavior. I think that for me, when I learned self-compassion, it helped a lot for me to like help her develop self-compassion, and also for me to help her see her own behavior, where she could say, yes, I am more, you know, I have bigger emotions and I feel less comfortable in my body and I don't read as well. And yet I have these gifts, right? But I felt like it took my own self-compassion for me to learn to embrace myself in a messy state, for me to learn to embrace her in a messy state. And to, you know, and I feel like before I had my own self-compassion practice, I could use the right words. I could say, yes, you want to pour oil all over the floor and then slide on it. But like my nonverbal said, and you need to knock this off. You know what I mean? Because I didn't know, I was afraid of her not being okay, if that makes sense. Like I like had shame layered on her behavior. And then as I developed self-compassion as a personal practice, it's kind of like I was able to both give her more compassion for her struggles and help her to internalize self-compassion.
Well, that's such a beautiful story that you just told, and you know, there's just so much in it. But first of all, I love the word that you used, match. There wasn't like a perfect match between the way she does things or did things and the way the world expects things to be done. And when there's that mismatch, there's often, you know, rebuke or criticism or scorn or something. And any child that's, you know, not neurotypical or whatever, you know, not the perfect match with mainstream culture, will inevitably get this over and over again, and it gets internalized for sure. But what I was particularly appreciating in your story was how you noticed that even with the best of intentions, you would either feel shame because of her behavior, or you would feel shame, you know, kind of for her, but in a sense, you initially were not the master of your shame. In other words, it was getting in the way of how you wanted to relate to your daughter. And what I was mostly appreciating is that by learning self-compassion, that the shame not only was revealed, but it was also healed in a way that it no longer forced itself between you and your child. And also I was appreciating what you were saying is that no matter what I said, if I was still feeling shame inside, it would be communicated, and that my child would get it. You know, my child would feel my shame as her shame. And so we can't fake it. We can't fake it. So the inner work of dismantling our shame through the opposite of shame, which is kindness, then allowed you to interact with your daughter without that obstacle, you know? It's just a beautiful example you gave, Jamie.
Oh, thank you. And that actually, this was my path to mindful self-compassion training, because when my daughter was 4, I went to see a therapist because she was having these meltdowns, and I would actually try to help her practice mindfulness, which was its own disaster. Every time I tried to help her to be mindful, it would get bigger. And I thought maybe it was my own childhood stuff. And so I went to see a therapist who told me I needed self-compassion. And then I started to learn self-compassion. And then that's when I realized that before I had self-compassion, when she was dysregulated, I was trying to fix her.
Yeah.
Right? Because, and it's partly because I hadn't learned how to hold my own messy self, right? Which I feel like that's part of what self-compassion is. And if you want to expand on it and how it's an antidote to shame, but I feel like part of what self-compassion gave me was the capacity to hold the imperfect parts of myself in a loving and tender way.
Yeah. Yeah, so there are two parts of that, how to hold the imperfect parts of ourselves. And let's face it, life is messy just about all the time. And when it comes to parenting, it is as messy as it can be because, as a parent, you're never good enough, So that's like the imperfect world. How can we hold ourselves as, good enough parents, and so I think that's a really key component. And I forget what the second part was that you were saying that.
I was just asking how it is, if you wanted to explain a bit about how it is that self-compassion is considered an antidote to shame. And maybe this is a little bit about how you became sort of an expert, if you will, on shame as it relates to self-compassion.
Well, I learned about self-compassion also through the doorway of shame. In other words, I wasn't interested in self-compassion at all until I had to deal with my shame. And this was, in my case, particularly public speaking anxiety. For 20 years, even though I was on the faculty at Harvard Medical School, I had public speaking anxiety, and I was also throughout this whole time a quote unquote expert in anxiety disorders, as a psychotherapist. So I had a very full toolbox, but literally nothing helped with my public speaking anxiety until I learned self-compassion. And I learned self-compassion because I was broken, like they say in Alcoholics Anonymous, the gift of desperation. When you've tried everything and nothing works, and one point I got up in front of a crowd to speak, and literally nothing came out of my mouth, like, and someone in the back of the room yells out, "Take a breath." That was like totally humiliating. But then I learned on a meditation retreat, loving kindness for oneself. Basically, the meditation teacher said, "Why don't you, instead of trying to meditate, Chris, why don't you just love yourself? Just say nice things to yourself, even repetitively, like, may I be safe, may I be peaceful, may I be healthy. Just be super kind to yourself." And so I just did that, following directions formulaically and so forth. And 4 months after I learned to do this, I was at a conference at Harvard Medical School. In fact, I organized a conference on meditation. And I got up to speak, and I was terrified as usual. But because I'd been saying these words to myself, I actually had a new voice in my head. And this new voice said, "Oh, may you be safe, may you be peaceful." And the most remarkable, this was in 2006, so 15 years ago. So from that point onward, I just haven't had public speaking anxiety much anymore. But in that moment, when I had this new voice in my head saying, "May you be safe, may you be peaceful," all the anxiety just melted away. And I looked out over at the audience, and I just felt so much warmth and kindness toward the audience, which was a radical departure from the previous years, because if you have public speaking anxiety, the audience is the enemy because they could criticize you. But I didn't care. I didn't care because there was this quality of inner kindness that was happening. And that's when I learned, Jamie, that public speaking anxiety is not an anxiety disorder. I'd been trying to heal my anxiety disorder, but it's actually a shame disorder. And all the anxiety I was feeling was actually coming from shame, and I wasn't touching the shame. And the shame was that I thought, if I'm going to stand in front of all these people, 500 people come to a conference, Harvard Medical School, and I can't speak, that means I'm fraudulent. I'm talking about mindfulness, and I can't speak out of nervousness. I'd be incompetent, and maybe even a little stupid, So these comments in my head, these are shaming comments. So this whole time, I was trying to be less anxious, but what I didn't realize is that I needed to figure out how to deal with shame. And the amazing thing is that self-compassion, or just in this way, being kind to myself, addressed the shame, and I didn't even know I had shame. That's the amazing thing. It healed the shame without knowing that I had shame. Because shame is very elusive. It can hide. It really hides amazingly well. But actually, self-compassion can get to the shame, and it can transform the shame wherever it is. It finds a way. So rather than, if you have a lot, this is really important for people to consider. If you consider yourself a shame-prone person, if just about anything happens makes you doubt yourself. When something goes wrong in life, you think, oh, my kid gets pulled to the principal's office for whatever. Oh, it's my fault, If everything is a self-criticism, and you think, I just don't want to live like this anymore. The way to approach it is not to say, okay, now what I need to do is to get rid of my shame, reduce my shame, stop my shame. That's not helpful. The way to do it is to actually instead refocus on the opposite of shame, which is self-kindness. And the more we experience self-kindness, the more we care for our wounded heart, like, oh, I'm feeling shame. This is so hard. We give ourselves love because of that difficulty. That actually dismantles the shame like nothing else. And it's also more fun because, whenever you think about shame, it's kind of a downer. But if you think about loving yourself and then the shame disappears on its own, that's a different story. The last thing is there are some sources of shame, particularly trauma, that actually do need to be addressed. However, how do we address them? The way we address those things is by developing the resource of self-compassion, to develop that strength. And then from a position of strength, of self-kindness, to begin to address some earlier life experiences that actually must be seen in order to heal. But we're not just going to go there unprotected. Self-compassion is a resource which makes it a safe and effective thing to do.
Wow, that's beautiful. Thank you. And I love how you're sharing with all of us that we can, instead of trying to make our shame go away or make our children's shame go away, right? Or our students, if we're an educator, can we increase our own self-love, our own self-compassion, and our children or our students' self-love and self-compassion? So rather than trying to get rid of the negative, can we increase what is enriching?
Yes. And often parents also, they worry like, oh, I shamed my child here. What a bad parent am I? Oh, I did this shaming thing for toward my child. Now my child's going to be damaged because of what I did. Parents do this. They do this to themselves. And it's just really important to know that, first of all that is part of the human experience. But if you would like to decrease the number of times that you might make a misstep that you regret as a parent, just be super kind to yourself when you notice you made a misstep. Be super kind to yourself when you're aware of it, and actually you're less likely to make the same misstep. If you shame yourself for shaming your child, actually you will learn very little, you will not change your behavior, and your child will also not learn much.
Wow.
So what we want to do we don't want to try to get rid of shame, nor do we want to feel ashamed about shame. What we want to do is to be kind to ourselves when we experience shame, and the shame in and of itself will start to dissolve, or at least to become what we might say at a workable level, Yeah.
Wow, that's so beautiful. I just have to take a few breaths to soak that in.
So when a parent worries, I'm going, I did this shaming thing to my child. The chances of repair, and even repair for the next 30 years, and the chances of not repeating things like that in the future is vastly increased not by beating up on ourselves, but by being kind to ourselves. Shame is not a problem. The question is there repair that follows? And repair is way more likely to happen when we cultivate the skill of self-compassion.
Right, and that makes sense because obviously the shame probably I'm imagining is like slightly amygdala based, right? Like it's and the kindness that activates more of this area, and so then we're going to be more able to act out of a wise space and a compassionate space. Whereas when we're sucked up in shame, we're trying to get out of shame, then it's its own cycle. Huh?
Yeah. So shame itself is a threat state. In other words, when we feel disconnected from our environment, we naturally feel vulnerable and threatened. And when we feel threatened, the amygdala part of the brain gets activated. But if we can activate the frontal part, which is executive function, we can downregulate the amygdala, and then we won't lose our cool. That's indeed the case. And what we found with self-compassion is that self-compassion actually activates the executive function, the ability to regulate emotions, and downregulates the amygdala. We've actually found that. And there's also research to show that the experience of shame is the opposite, right? So even neurologically, we can see that the activation of the threat state in a moment of shame is the opposite of the activation in the brain of a self-compassion state. Think of it like this. It's an antidote, even neurologically.
Wow, that's powerful. This also, our conversation and something you shared in what you talked about with the idea that public speaking anxiety is actually shame. It makes me a little curious. And I know we just have a few more minutes here on this topic, and I know you're going to lead us in a practice. And I also want to share a space if there's any extra advice you want to give parents and educators. But it made me curious about, is that true for a lot of anxiety behaviors? Like I had even brought my daughter to like an ADD clinic, right? When she was, a certain age, because she just couldn't focus in school. And they said, she doesn't have ADD, she's anxious. And I thought, and I think she might've been anxious because she felt stressed because, well, one, reading was so hard, but then, and having a neurological system of senses was hard. But then I think that she would cycle because she'd feel ashamed. And I've even heard, perfectionism, Brene Brown says, perfectionism is a shame shield. So I'm curious, how many of our anxiety disorders are actually indeed shame disorders or shame-based or at least shame-driven? Yeah.
So I don't know I can't give you numbers on that, but there is no doubt that particularly that anxiety disorders are often related to shame, but particularly performance anxiety and social anxiety. So like public speaking anxiety is both a social anxiety, form of social anxiety and performance anxiety. But sometimes people, for example, panic in social settings and so forth. And often there is shame behind that. In other words, like if you have a panic disorder, for example, you might be afraid of vomiting. Well, one person without shame will say, so you vomit. And somebody with a lot of shame would say, that would be the end of my life if I ever vomited, So in that way, shame could be behind it or not. Shyness is an interesting one because there's kind of some overlap with shame and shyness, but not really, but not necessarily, because 50% of shyness appears to be entirely inherited, genetically determined, which means that there's no, not necessarily kind of fear of negative social evaluation. It's just that we prefer not to be around a lot of people, So there could be a shame element to shyness, or maybe there isn't a shame element to shyness. But what's really worth thinking about is that when when there is any really sticky emotion, Jamie, like somebody who's angry all the time, or somebody who's anxious all the time, or somebody who is sad all the time, or somebody who's stuck in grief all the time, to ask, is there a shame component? Because the shame is often like glue that makes these difficult emotions sticky, you know? So for example, if a person is grieving, like somebody died, and they just can't seem to get over it, often there's the thought, maybe I wasn't a good enough person around the person who passed away. So that's like an element of shame that bleeds into grief. Or with anxiety, what are you afraid of? Well, I'm afraid of looking like a fool. That would be a shame element. Or depression. What goes on in your mind when you're depressed? Well, I'm always beating up on myself and I think I really suck and I'm an idiot and I keep telling well, it's really hard not to be depressed if you're talking to yourself all the time like this. So shame is often at the root of sticky emotions, not just anxiety, but other emotions. But it's also possible to have these difficult emotions, and they can be sticky without shame. So everybody's different.
Interesting. And I'm thinking, I know I've heard it said many a time that silence is one of the things that keeps shame active. And so as parents and educators, I'm imagining that naming shame, being able to like say in an appropriate way to our kids, oh, this happened and I felt really ashamed. And then I reminded myself, everyone makes mistakes, or I'm wondering if you're feeling ashamed. I would imagine that naming this to our children, or our students probably is really a key component in liberating ourselves. Do you want to speak to that at all?
Yeah, well, so you're naming, there's an expression, name it and you tame it. Name it and you tame it. And usually people, the first step of working with shame is to de-shame shame through information, what we call like bibliotherapy, like just learn all about it, you know? And the more you learn about shame, actually, we learn that shame is actually an innocent emotion, which is crazy to think about, but it's innocent because it comes from the wish to be loved. It comes from the wish to belong. It comes from the wish to connect. It comes from the wish to be liked. And this is hardwired in all of us. So the more we learn about shame, the more we can name shame and even step back and say, whoa, this is shame, is we get a little emotional freedom or disentanglement from the shame. Just a little bit. So actually, what you're saying, Jamie, I think couldn't be more spot on. In my view, simply to be able to name shame while it's happening. In other words, not just learn all about the theory and science of shame, but in the moment to be able to say, oh, this is shame. I'm feeling shame. That's half the game. The other half is, what do you do? At that moment, that's where self-compassion comes in. Then be actually kind to yourself, not to make the shame go away, but because you're feeling shame, you know? And that's the tricky part, because people usually think, oh, I can't be kind to myself in the midst of shame because I'm so unworthy. I'm so undeserving. I'm so bad. What do you mean? You know, the last thing that I deserve right now is kindness. And actually, in that moment, the thing that we need the most in that moment is kindness. So how do we then give it to ourselves? So as you said, first step, name it and you tame it. Name it and you get a little disentangled. But what do you do in that space? Kindness to oneself. How do we get to that when we feel like we don't deserve it? So that's what I'm writing a book about. Yeah. And, you know, in a nutshell, we have to go slow. And the first step is to realize that actually shame is an innocent emotion because it comes from the wish to be loved. And when we can connect with that fundamental innocence that we all have, that wish to be loved, we actually, in a preliminary way, start to feel more deserving. When we connect with our innocence, we start to feel more deserving. And we were all born with this innocence. You know, we were trained to be shamed. We were not born with, you know, that kind of shame. We were born innocent. And even in this moment, in this very moment, we all are innocent. We're still trying to do the best we can do under difficult circumstances. And you know what? We screw up. Everyone does. And when we screw up, you know what? Part of that deal is we beat up on ourselves. And you know what that is? That's shame. That's all part of the human experience. Can we be kind to ourselves simply because this is so? Can we actually feel that common humanity and especially the commonness of the wish to be loved? Can we start to connect with that? And when we do, then a sense of deservedness comes up. Basically, we learn then that we can treat ourselves with the same kindness and understanding as we would treat a dear friend who is feeling shame under the same circumstances in the same kind of moment, you know. So that's all self-compassionate. It's treating ourselves with the same kindness and understanding as we would treat a friend. In a moment of shame, how would I treat a friend? Can I treat myself like this? Give it a try, you know.
Absolutely. And I know for myself, part of what liberated me from it's, and even I like learn little bits and pieces, but I remember Tara Brach talked about the trance of unworthiness, which I feel like is related to shame. And part of what liberated me from believing that shame was true was actually learning about like the negative core beliefs that people have, and that there's there's like maybe 10 to 15 kind of negative core beliefs, like I'm unlovable or I'm a failure. And there's 7 billion people, which means like, 500 million people share my negative core belief. And I thought, all these other people, like kind of this idea of treat others as you'd want to be treated. When I look at other people, these other 500 million people who might also think that they're unworthy, do I think their flaws make them unworthy of love?
Yeah.
And I thought, no. And then I thought, okay, how likely is it that my flaws, I'm like the 1 out of 7 billion that have flaws,
who really doesn't deserve love. That would be,
But seriously, I really thought it until I somehow was able to unpack it in a way where I thought, if I think about treating myself like a good friend, if they have flaws and they're still lovable, it's pretty likely that the same is true for me. And that somehow then helped me to tease out, I think, again, that the lie of shame was that I had to be perfect to be lovable.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. It's the lie of shame. It's really a lie. Yeah. And the other weird thing about shame is it's a global emotion. When we feel shame, we feel globally unworthy. But when we see a friend feeling shame, we don't see them as globally unworthy. We see them in all their goodness, and we also know their, flaws and things, and we love them because they're a person and they're our friend. But when we have shame, it's global. We are, garbage, and we might as well just disappear from this earth, So that's another one of these really tricky things about shame. It just like takes us over. But even then, apropos, what does it take to begin to bring kindness to ourselves when we feel undeserving? Another way of doing that is to recognize that as a human being, we have different parts. We have like really amazing parts, and we have parts we kind of are not too proud of, we'd like to hide. But just because we've connected with a part we're not proud of and we like to hide, that doesn't mean that's all of us. We need to remember that's actually only a part of us. And not only that, the shame itself is not who we are. The shame is a burden that part of us is bearing. It's a burden which feels like it is us and it's all of us, but it's just a piece. If I had like a really traumatic childhood experience and decided that, I'm an unworthy person, that's a burden that child is carrying even to this day. It is not a reflection of that child's essence, So one thing that allows us also to to begin to open the door to self-kindness is to recognize that we are really made up of many different parts. And actually none of them are bad. It's just some of them are carrying burdens. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks. Yeah, some of them carry burdens and probably some of them are unskillful in their strategies, right?
Yeah, that would be a good point. Like getting angry all the time, not helpful.
Mhm.
Or drinking too much, not very useful, because sometimes our reactions actually create shame. We become ashamed for the things that we do in order not to feel shame. So it can be a bit like the snake biting its own tail.
Absolutely, the downward spiral. So that's the downward spiral of shame. So I'm hoping, I feel like
Yeah.
I'd love to talk to you for like another hour, but I know we're going to
Yeah.
confine our time to an hour here. So I'm hoping you can guide us through a practice that everyone, and especially us as parents and educators, might be able to use when we notice that we're headed towards shame, right? Like what can we do to be mindful of the shame, but then bring in that self-compassion so we don't just spiral down into the toilet of shame.
Yeah, till the toilet. So as you said, just to be able to name shame, like, oh, this is shame, is huge. You know what it's like? It's like in the Wizard of Oz when the dog Toto pulled back the curtain of the wizard, and everybody thought the wizard was like some enormously scary thing, and it was just some benign little guy with hands on levers. That's shame. Shame is like that benign little guy. So when you can say, what is shame? It's just like pulling back the curtain. Is this shame? Yeah, I see it. So that's the first half. But then the second half is to give ourselves kindness. So what I'd like to do for an exercise is to invite everybody to think about a time when they feel some shame, and I'll lead you through this. And then I'll offer you three simple self-compassion practices that you can do in order to care for yourself in that moment of shame. And that's what we call the compassionate U-turn. The kindness that we would normally give to somebody else, we will then give it to ourselves. So this whole practice will take about 10 minutes, okay? Does that make sense?
Sounds wonderful.
Yeah. So as we did in the beginning of this talk, I'd like everyone just to find a comfortable position and to allow your eyes to close, partially or fully. It might be helpful if it feels comfortable to close them fully. And I'd like you to bring to mind a situation in which you felt ashamed, but just mildly ashamed. Not moderately, not severely, just mildly. And this is for the sake of this exercise so that you can get through it and learn something. So mildly ashamed may be for you, you got a call from the principal's office that your son was, misbehaving. Maybe you felt some shame. Or maybe you were supposed to meet somebody for dinner and you forgot. And they're sitting there and they call you on a cell phone and you go, oh, what kind of a bad person am I that I didn't remember to see my friend. So I'd like you to think of some event that occurred in your life that there was kind of a pinch of shame, not a huge amount. And I'd like you to feel your way into it. In other words, who's there? What was said? And mostly, how does it feel in your body to feel shame? Like that burst of shame, like, oh, what does that feel like? So just to recollect the inner experience of shame, the emotions, the physical sensations. And even noticing where in your body you feel it the most. Is it in your head as kind of emptiness or tightness in the throat or the chest? Maybe it feels like you got sucker punched in your stomach. For you in particular, where do you feel shame the most? Okay, so in daily life, we don't have to go looking for shame, but for the sake of this exercise, that's what we're doing. And what I'd like you to do now is just in a really kind way, name it for yourself. Say, oh, that's shame. Oh, you're feeling shame. Shame is a universal human emotion. Everyone feels shame. I am not alone. This is shame. Shame is part of the human experience. So this is the first part. Now the second part is actually being kind to ourselves because we feel shame. So what I'd like you to do first, if you don't mind, is to, if it feels right to you, to put a hand on that part of the body that you feel shame the most. Just placing a hand over that part of your body and just feeling the gentle touch of your hand and the warmth of your hand. And just allowing kindness to flow through your fingers into your body, because you are feeling the difficulty of shame as all human beings feel it. Just sending kindness to that part of your body that has been holding shame for so long, doing so much work. And if you like, you can even gently rub that part of your body, back and forth or circular motion. There's a way of tending to this part of your body that holds shame the most. And now, leaving your hand there, if it feels comfortable, I'd like you to imagine the eyes, the face of a person, but mostly the eyes of someone who you experience genuine kindness or compassion from. So it could be the eyes of a puppy or a dog that you know. Could be the eyes of some person whom you admire that you might have only seen on in a magazine. It could be the eyes of a spiritual figure. It could be the eyes of a child gazing at its mother. I'd like you to visualize at this moment those eyes. And I'd just take a moment to soak in the experience of receiving this kindness. Being in the presence of these kind eyes. Allowing yourself to bathe in that gaze. And now finally shifting our attention to a third part, and this part is gentle vocalization. So I'd like you to do, imagine right now, as you're feeling this moment of shame, or imagining if it was at that time, what words would you have loved to hear whispered into your ear? Or even now, as you reflect on this moment, what words would you love to hear spoken to you right now. So maybe the words would have been, you know, you're a good person, or you're a good parent, or you are a good friend, I know it. Or maybe the words, I'm here for you, I believe in you, I trust you, I love you. What words would be medicine for you in a moment like this? The words that you need to hear. And now just allowing yourself to hear those words over and over again, like a mantra. And now let's bring it all together, just continuing to hear those words. Perhaps feel your hand on the part of your body that holds shame. And maybe even visualize those compassionate eyes. The warm gaze, soothing touch, and kind words, all at the same time. Or if you wish, just allowing yourself to focus on one part of those three parts. Maybe just enjoying the gaze, feeling the touch, or hearing the words. Whatever is easiest for you, whatever is most delightful, whatever is just what you need right now. And now beginning to release this practice, letting it go. And just allowing yourself to rest in your body and feel whatever is there right now. Allowing this little meditation, this little experience to be just as it was. Allowing yourself to feel right now whatever you're feeling. And most importantly, allowing yourself to be, if only for this moment, just as you are. Just like this. And before you open your eyes, knowing that whenever you feel a moment of shame, if it, you know that feeling, whenever you feel it, you can say, oh, this is shame. You can find it in your body. You can offer yourself some soothing touch. And if you like, you can visualize the kind eyes of someone. And you can even begin to offer yourself the words that you need to hear in a moment like that. Whatever comes easiest. And when you're ready to gently open your eyes.
Oh, thank you so much, Chris. That was beautiful. Brought tears to my eyes. And what was wonderful was to notice, so I noticed when you said the eyes of another, and I kind of tried out a few pairs of eyes before I found the eyes of someone who's so loving. And when I pictured their eyes, my shoulders softened, right? Like the tightness because sometimes it's an inward in my chest, it softened when I pictured their eyes, and I thought, how appropriate, because shame is scorn through the eyes of another. And so imagining love through the eyes of another. And then this kind of brought me full circle back to this idea as parents and educators. If we have a child, a student that's experiencing shame, sometimes maybe even more important than our words is We let them see
Mm.
love through our eyes.
Mm.
And if we do that, can we help them to
Mm.
heal our shame,
Mm.
to heal their shame?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Jamie.
So thank you, especially knowing that you used to have a fear of public speaking. Thank you so much for
some
for joining us today.
some people wish I still had fear of public speaking.
Oh,
I talk so much, right?
Oh, no, it's a delight. It's really a delight to have you here with us.
Thank you.
And I look forward. I know you have a kind of an advanced mindful self-compassion class on shame, a kind of a deep dive, if you will. And we look forward to your book that comes out too, and just learning more. It's again, we appreciate your words and also how you embody that compassionate, that loving presence.
Well, thank you, Jamie. I really enjoyed this conversation. I also really appreciate the work you're doing, and also everybody who's listening to this. That we're all on this team. Team compassion. We're trying to bring a little goodness into the world. I like that. Compassion is also strong.
It is. It's fierce. Yes.
It's tender, but it's also fierce. Takes boldness to be compassionate in this world. Anyhow, so thanks to you, and thanks to all your listeners who are doing this good work.
Absolutely. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The world keeps turning, things change. We have new obstacles that are thrown in our way. You can't hold us down. Together we'll get around. You just have to look inside, and you will find that we are in it together. I know it in my heart. You are not alone. You are not, and we are in it together. I've known it from the start. You are not alone. You are not alone. You might feel lonely and down. You might be thinking things will always be this way. But you got a friend in you. Self-compassion will get you through. You just have to look inside, and you will find that we are in it together. I know it in my heart. You are not alone. You are not, and we are in it together. I've known it from the start. You are not alone. You are not alone. We've got Bunny. You're not alone. Doodles, what can you do? Spots, we can be aware. And Snuggles, I care about you. When life gets hard,